Hello, and welcome to my video concerning my professional consultation to other mental health professionals. So, my audience here with this particular video is other mental health professionals. And if you're watching this, it's probable that a parent in the family courts has asked you to watch this particular video from Dr. Childress, where I talk to other mental health professionals about the situation in the family courts. Um, Likely, the parent is asking for one of two things, potentially for an assessment and diagnosis of the pathology of the problem in the family. Particularly, we're concerned about possible psychological child abuse by the allied parent who may have a narcissistic borderline dark personality spectrum pathology. And so the parent is, and the courts are seeking an accurate diagnosis of what the problem is in the family, whether there's child abuse and by which parent, and the nature. Or the parent is asking for treatment of the family, and they're looking for somebody they can provide to the court who's willing to do the treatment. And because diagnosis guides treatment, that would also involve um, the diagnostic assessment of the family and getting a clear diagnosis. And the situation in the family courts currently is that there's no uh, competent mental health services in the family courts. These parents and these children and the courts have all been abandoned. That professional psychology has abandoned the children in the family courts and their parents because of two reasons. We got two aspects of psychology. The forensic psychologists who have been working in the family courts and do their custody evaluations for the past couple of decades have failed. The forensic psychology and the custody evaluations that they do are a failed experiment in service delivery to a vulnerable population in the family courts. So the parents and children and the courts over here don't have competent mental health services from the forensic psychologists. And in addition, the clinical psychologists refuse to work in the family courts because it's too dangerous to their licenses. And so the pathology, and also the pathology is non treatable because of the court's involvement. And so, because of that, the parents and the courts have no competent mental health services in the family. So, you're potentially being asked for one of two reasons. Either you are within the domain of forensic psychology, but you're considering and willing to leave that type of practice, forensic practice for this particular case, and to operate as a clinical psychologist. We need a diagnostic assessment and treatment plan. And so, a reformed forensic psychologist, potentially, who is coming back to clinical practice in the family courts, or a clinical psychologist who's working with personality disorders or spousal abuse or attachment pathology or some domain that's related, dialectic behavior therapist or something, who is willing to come back to the courts to be in a clinical psychology role around diagnosis and assessment. The Yeah, so the problem faced by the families is that there's no competent mental health services in the family courts. And the accurate diagnosis that's needed over here is an accurate DSM diagnosis is child psychological abuse, the 995.51. And the actual pathology that lands on that diagnosis is a shared or induced persecutory delusion and false factitious attachment pathology created in the child for secondary gain to a narcissistic borderline dark personality parent. And essentially, what's going on is spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. And so the allied parent has narcissistic or borderline, potentially dark personality pathology, and it's collapsing around the divorce. And the persecutory belief system, the persecutory delusion, is a trauma origin delusion. So the childhood trauma that they had that produced the personality pathology has left their thinking and perceptions kind of distorted. And so that's creating this false belief in supposed victimization, the persecutory belief system, thought disorder, that then leads them to produce this false attachment pathology, a factitious disorder imposed on the child, essentially. And so, and that either one or both of those, shared delusion, factitious disorder, is going to wind up on the child abuse diagnosis. And that's what we need, because diagnosis guides treatment. And this is child abuse, and this is spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. So we have two abuse range pathologies here. So in the clinical psychologist, I'm recommending that parents look in the stronger trauma-based clinical psychologists, such as dialectic behavior therapists who work with borderline. You'll be able to see the borderline and the persecutory beliefs, or the intimate partner violence, IPV domestic violence therapist, who will recognize the narcissistic dad and kind of situation, and the spousal abuse. They're more familiar with that. And both of those would have relevant background. It's also an attachment pathology, delusional thought disorder, family systems pathology. So there's a lot going on in the family courts, and we need high quality mental health people over here. That's not what we have in the forensic people. So we're trying to get some high quality mental health services who can provide the court with an accurate diagnosis. And this is important from a clinical psychology perspective. Is the family courts, the judge has an incredible, momentous decision to make around this child. The child's life is going to turn out drastically different based on the court's decision. And we're concerned about child abuse by one parent or the other, because there's severe attachment pathology. We have a child rejecting a parent. That only happens with child abuse range pathology. And so we're looking for somebody with a professional capability and to come over here and provide the court with the necessary information, an accurate diagnosis that the court can then rely on in its decision making surrounding the child. Now, just to support that forensic psychology is a problem, a recent independent review from the New York Blue Ribbon Commission on Forensic Custody Evaluations found that ultimately the commission members agree that some New York judges order forensic evaluations too frequently and often place undue reliance upon them. Judges order forensic evaluations to provide relevant information regarding the best interests of the children, and some go far beyond an assessment of whether either party has a mental health condition that has affected their parenting behavior. So that's what we're looking for, an assessment of whether either party has a mental health condition affecting their parental behavior, and the mental health condition specifically is a shared delusional persecutory delusion surrounding the collapse of a narcissistic borderline personality pathology. We don't need the diagnosis of the personality pathology per se. We need the shared delusional disorder, factitious attachment pathology. That's going to lead us to the child psychological abuse diagnosis that we can then act on. The court can act on, the treatment providers can act on, everybody can act on an accurate diagnosis of the child psychological abuse. Now, the Blue Ribbon Commission went on to say that in their analysis, evaluators may rely on principles and methodologies of dubious validity, in some cases because of a lack of evidence or the inability of parties to pay for expensive challenges of an evaluation. Defective reports can escape meaningful scrutiny and are often accepted by the court with potentially disastrous consequences for parents and children. By an 11-9 margin, the majority of the commission members favored the elimination of forensic custody evaluations entirely, arguing that these reports are biased and harmful to children and lack scientific or legal value. At worst, evaluations can be dangerous, particularly in situations of domestic violence or child abuse. These members reached the conclusion that the practice is beyond reform and that no amount of training for the courts, forensic evaluators, or other court personnel will successfully fix the bias, inequity, and conflict of interest issues that exist within the system. So, the situation relative to the forensic and custody evaluation and clinical psychologist is that the forensic psychology in the family courts will be ending. And I think this Blue Ribbon Commission gives an indication of why. It's a failed approach to service delivery to a vulnerable population. And as a result, court involved clinical psychology is going to have to come back as a practice. And that's the diagnosis and treatment of pathology, not custody. And so we need to get the clinical psychologists back to fix things after this failed experiment of forensic psychology. Problem is, clinical psychologists haven't been here for 40 years. And so there's competence issues all around. The forensic psychologists aren't competent in delusional thought disorders or what they're doing. It's just horrific, the custody evaluations. And the clinical psychologists in general practice aren't familiar with the pathology in the family courts, the narcissistic borderline dark personality collapsing into persecutory delusions and how that gets involved with the courts. And so the clinical psychologists don't practice here because it's dangerous to your license, because you got a delusional narcissistic borderline person over here who's collapsing, and then the court gets involved and interferes with treatment, and it's just not worth it. And you're going to get licensing board complaints potentially from the pathological parent, and there's just problems. But as forensic psychology collapses, there's no mental health people here. So we need to get court-involved clinical psychologists. So that's an emerging field. And if you're in, I think you're going to get a lot of practice. And it's a very structured domain. It's a very doable thing once you begin to consider and recognize that as a profession, we have an obligation to these families and to the children. This is child abuse pathology, and the clinical people need to get over here and start protecting these kids from the pathology of a narcissistic borderline dark personality parent. So we need, what parents and children in the family courts need is a proper assessment for the pathology involved that will return an accurate diagnosis. The courts can decide on custody. What the courts need from professional mental health people is the diagnosis that the court can rely on, and the treatment plan to fix things. And so the targeted parent is hoping that that professional will be you, which is why they're asking you to potentially read or watch this video from Dr. Childress. And so the family needs a proper risk assessment for the potential diagnoses involved. The potential diagnoses that we need a clinical diagnostic assessment on is whether the targeted parent is abusing the child in some way. And if they are, specify what they're doing that's abusive so that we can put it on a treatment plan and fix it. And if they are, then they are creating the child's attachment pathology towards that parent. Or is the allied parent psychologically abusing the child by creating a shared induced persecutory delusion and false factitious attachment pathology in the child for secondary gain to the pathological narcissistic borderline dark personality parent? And so that's the differential diagnosis that's needed from clinical psychology. The DSM diagnostic considerations are involved are the persecutory thought disorder shared, a factitious disorder imposed on another, the false factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child for secondary gain to the pathological parent of manipulating the court's decisions regarding child custody and to meet that parent's own emotional and psychological needs. The two substantial DSM diagnoses that will allow us to act in our protective role is the DSM-5 diagnosis of child psychological abuse, and the diagnosis of spouse or partner abuse psychological should be also considered diagnosis, because that's really the one that's driving this. The pathology at its core is spousal abuse using the child as a weapon. And then in weaponizing the child, they produce such severe pathology in the child, it becomes child psychological abuse. But fundamentally, at its core, it's a spousal abuse pathology. And so there's two sources of potential competence that parents are seeking and asking uh, from the involved mental health professionals. One is from the sort of a reformed forensic psychologist who is leaving the failed model of forensic custody evaluations. They just don't feel good about what's happening there. And they are returning to court involved clinical psychology, diagnosis and treatment, not custody. And I would estimate a clinical diagnostic assessment can be pulled in within 4 to 6 weeks for around $2,500, maybe 3,000, 5,000, maybe with a second opinion on it. So it's relatively brief, focused. You're looking to one diagnostic question to answer for the court. And the other potential source of competence are new entry clinical psychologists from related field who are returning to the family courts. The related fields might be personality disorders or family systems or complex trauma, child abuse, spousal abuse, so any of the surrounding domain, or just a new entry psychologist who's interested in working in the family courts. I would particularly encourage parents to look within the dialectic behavior therapy community because of the experience in borderline personality pathology, which is what we have here, and the intimate partner violence communities, domestic violence, again, because that's what we have here, narcissistic spousal abuse of a parent. If you're thinking about returning to the family courts, thank you and encourage it. If you're seeking any sort of scaffolding support, I have a consulting website that's available, and there's a whole section on for mental health professionals. You can go and read more about what the pathology is, and then in addition, um, I have general public consultations the first week of every month in my online office, and scheduling is available through my website, my consulting website. So if you're interested in consulting with me for some reason, you can always schedule on to my first of the month weekly consults, and we can get a consult either on your potential involvement in this particular matter or just at any point in time relative to the pathology in the family courts. And so, with that, I'm going to close off this segment where I'm speaking specifically with the mental health professionals. These parents and children and the court need competent mental health services to return an accurate diagnosis and an effective treatment plan. And they're not getting that. And so, we're trying to figure out how do we get competent services to these families. And you're being asked to potentially consider that role. So thank you so much, and good luck. And I have a lot of other videos and information if you want to learn more about the pathology in the family courts. So take care, and thank you for